Second most, I said.
All right, we're live, folks.
Red top.
Good morning and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This morning we have with us TJ Poor from the Public Utility Commission and Melissa Bailey from the Department of Public Service. Welcome.
Thank you. And for the record, TJ Poor for the Department of Public Service also.
Okay.
Work together, Public Service Department. So, so thank you for having us in to testify on S5. And we asked to testify as the Department of Public Services, both the state energy office in the state and we're the ratepayer advocate. And so we thought not only that, but we're implicated by a number of these areas of S5. We thought it was really important for us to come in and speak to it and share our thoughts here. We'll try and go quickly. I think it seems like a pretty hard stop at 9:30, if I understand. Last time I was in, I mentioned that I didn't have a slide on the comprehensive energy plan, so I didn't want to make that mistake again. So, I just remind folks that as it relates to the clean heat standard, the comprehensive energy plan called it a promising idea and called for the comprehensive evaluation of the clean heat standard. And what that was intended to do was to actually allow for a better understanding of really what the costs and benefits of the clean heat standard are, not only societally, which the pathways were that's a big societally, but also to Vermonters and to different communities of Vermonters. And so to really understand kind of what the implications are to Vermont of the clean heat standard. Not only that, but it would allow for equity considerations to be pulled in. So to actually hear voices of Vermonters as we're designing the program. That did not really happen in the climate action plan process. As everybody knows, that was a really fast process, that it was a mad dash to get the plan out. And that engagement didn't happen there. And it didn't happen in the energy plan either, to be fair, but we didn't want to move forward without actually having it happen. So just kind of from a broad sense, there's, I think the state has recognized, the legislature has recognized, the energy plan and recognized that there's really a need to act on greenhouse gas emissions. And we are acting on greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating in the thermal sector, making really significant investments in electrification and weatherization. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And really the foundation of existing programs that we had in weatherization and tier 3 has really been able to be expanded by an influx of federal funds. All the reports that we get as the state energy office and talking with implementers is that really it's unlikely that more could be done in the near term, given workforce shortages, supply chain shortages. So ramping up any faster than we are would be a real challenge. In fact, Efficiency Vermont is kind of diverting some of its base thermal efficiency and process fuel funds from weatherization to help with workforce, but to not kind of be promote to projects because there's just not enough workers out there to do the projects. So in terms of timing, we're not going to accelerate with this bill in the near term progress because we're going as fast as we can. So with that in mind, really the goal should be to develop a long-term strategy that does reduce emissions, but that enhances equity and takes it into account procedural equity as we build the policy and doesn't impose unnecessary costs. And to do that, we really need to have the process be informed by Vermonters.
Representative Stebbins.
This bill wouldn't really, I mean, the first year and a half is essentially putting together an engineering plan to really work through the structural components of how this would work. So I don't really see this bill actually implemented and actually reaching Vermonters for like potentially 3 years by the time we really see it. So I guess I'm wondering what your comment is. I mean, do you think we should postpone it farther than 3 years, or what are you meaning by near term?
Oh, I think the point is that we have, we'll talk a little more about the analysis that's happening and that we have time to actually understand the costs and benefits and get input from Vermonters before we design kind of the solution in the thermal sector. And so even if we did this and had we find the results of the thermal sector analysis, we understand what the costs are to Vermonters and different demographics. It doesn't mean we're pushing back of the implementation of S5.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. I've listened to some testimony in the last few days about the pros and cons of this bill. And from what I'm hearing, Fuel Dealers Association said that they are working endlessly, and the Vermont Gas is working nonstop to improve better heating systems for a lot of the people that are taking the initiatives of being green on their own. And at that rate, it seems to me like this bill would be unnecessary as long as Vermonters keep proceeding in that direction. Would I be right or wrong in assuming something like that?
Well, I think that, first we're, as part of the analysis, we're revising kind of what the business as usual results are going to be. What's going to be the gap as we understand the federal funding, as we understand what, we already have in the model what Vermont Gas has been doing and is going to do. I think there is still a gap. We don't have the business as usual yet. We're supposed to see a draft today or this weekend, but we think it's likely that there's still going to be a gap, even with the federal funding, with the progress that has been made by all the people implementing. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that in the near term, that there's just not the people on the ground to go any faster than over the next couple of years.
And I think what I heard.
Representative Smith, we really need to let them get through the presentation. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are hard stop at 9:30.
All right.
Thank you.
Recognizing the timing constraints, I'll go pretty quickly on this. Again, Melissa Bailey, Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources with the Department of Public Service. My team does oversee the verification activities around the efficiency utilities and would do the savings verification as contemplated in S5. We'd also have a keen eye on integration with existing programs that are running through the state. I just want to touch quickly on some of the initiatives that are moving forward. I know TJ had this slide presented to you, I think last week, but didn't really have time to touch on the elements. I will go quickly, but I think it's important to have a kind of holistic, comprehensive look at what's happening in the efficiency space. Absent S5, we're working hard to deploy $67 million in ARPA funds that are flowing through the department for weatherization, for the deployment of heat pump water heaters, for electric panel upgrades that support electrification, for energy storage directed at low and moderate income households. As the state energy office, we're receiving $3 million under IIJA discretionary funds. We're using a good chunk of that to do workforce training and workforce development, again, as a supporting policy that goes along with customer direct programs. Additional funds under IIJA were directed through Act 174 to BGS for municipalities to expand the state energy management program. There's the congressionally directed spending of $8.5 million directed to Vermont Energy Investment Corporation to support clean heat homes. So more work around weatherization and electrification in homes. The governor's budget proposal included an additional $5 million for that initiative, the Clean Heat Homes Initiative. And then we're poised to receive $58 million in Inflation Reduction Act funding, again, targeted for comprehensive energy savings projects in households and electrification, point of sale rebates for low and moderate income households. And then finally, we're working closely with the Climate Action Office on some EPA funding for greenhouse gas reduction. So again, and our kind of structure and framework in looking at these funds is, as TJ alluded to, filling the gaps, looking at what's happening already and where is additional investment needed, and being really strategic in deploying funds where there are gaps.
Yeah, we just have to,
I have a 2-second question, I hope.
okay, Representative Logan.
Thank you. I see one spot here where workforce training is named as an eligible cost. Can ARPA or IRA funds be used for workforce development as part of the implementation?
So that bucket of funding is our state energy program funding, which is pretty flexible. We typically receive a formula allocation every year of several $100,000, which largely goes to staffing at the department. Under IIJA, they bumped that up to 3 million. So yes, those funds in particular, that state energy office funding is extremely flexible. It's being used. I think we're putting about $1 million towards paying weatherization contractors.
Thank you.
So quickly, these slides should go quickly because they're graphics. This is just, apologies, this is kind of small, but again, this shows, I think TJ showed you guys this last week. It shows the history of homes being weatherized over the years. And you see through 2026, due to the federal funding and the investments, the 80 million in ARPA funds going to low and moderate income weatherization kind of accounts for that ramp up in 24, 5, and 6. And then what we're expecting is a drop off after 2026. And this is really an area of focus for us is how do we achieve a sustainable pace of weatherization and funding for those programs in the long term, over the long term. It's a troubling market signal to show short-term funding and then like I said, precipitous drop off. And then the chart on the right shows cumulatively how far we've been since 2008. And I should have marked on here, but the top line, basically, there should be a big star at the top. That's 120,000 units. And that's our best planning estimate of where we need to be by 2030. And so that, again, is the gap that we're talking about needing to get from the top of this chart, cumulative, where we expect to be to where we need to be. So again, just pointing out that weatherization is a critical gap and our area of focus. A little bit of a different story with heat pumps. This shows our heat pump forecast from the most recent energy efficiency potential study, which we carry out every 3 years to inform the energy efficiency utilities planning and budget. So Efficiency Vermont, Burlington Electric Department, and Vermont Gas Systems budget. Again, this shows our forecast of units, cumulative units, and the line on the top shows where the pathways report showed we would need to be consistent with meeting our GWSA requirements. So you'll see there's not much of a gap. There's a low scenario and a high scenario, and we're pretty much on track to meet our heat pump deployment targets.
Okay, so back to public engagement. I already mentioned this a little bit, but in the bill, the procedural equity is lacking. So Vermonters really have not had an opportunity to shape this proposal. And I think this really comes into focus where, there are mechanisms for public engagement in the bill, absolutely, but they come at a time and at a place where the commission will have very little discretion to actually make changes. And I think that's the important takeaway that, we just passed Act 154 and last year, and that defines environmental justice and talks about procedural equity for the meaningful participation of all individuals. And I think that's just a big question we have, is whether the engagement is really going to be meaningful. If Vermonters can come to the table or invited to the table to really put input on something that there is no discretion to change. And then I'm sure you expected us to talk about cost. Really want to talk about the uncertainty around cost. We really don't know what this policy will cost and what it will cost relative to other options. There's a few folks who have testified, a few witnesses have testified that there's mechanisms in S5 to smooth costs, but those mechanisms don't really lower the costs. So there's the early adopter credits that are in the bill that, credits, if this passed, as of January of this year would count, right? So that kind of is intended to smooth the transition. But because the Public Utility Commission has to set the target to meet the GWSA requirement, that all that means is the PUC, the commission, has to increase the targets. And so those early adopter credits, they'll count. They'll be really useful for the folks who are already implementing this year to lower their cost, and kind of those embedded, those market actors who are already doing things will get a lot of benefit. But really the total cost won't change because the gap is the gap, and the PUC will have to set targets to fill that gap under this. And so it's not really a mechanism that will reduce overall cost. And then the commission also has the ability to relieve obligations, right? So if for good cause, I think is the language that the commission can essentially pause or reduce an obligation for a provider. And that is temporary, right? And so the requirement after 18 months as it is now, or even after 36 months, as I think was contemplated in some of the testimony this week, the commission will have to set the targets the next year to still meet the requirements. And so it is a temporary reprieve for one market actor, but not a actual cost reduction for the whole program. And I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. The other policies that this has been compared to in Vermont were implemented with cost containment mechanisms. There was the overall cap on the budget for Efficiency Vermont, which eventually was lifted by the legislature. And then for the renewable energy standard, there's an alternative compliance payment. And this afternoon, we'll be in to talk a little more about the structure of the renewable energy standard, but it basically says that it sets up the mechanism where if the price of compliance is over a certain amount, then the utility, it's capped. The utility would pay that amount instead of supplying renewable energy. And so the point of those things is that the legislature is saying we're willing to pay up to this much for this policy. We achieve these goals. We're willing to pay up to $60 a megawatt hour in the renewable energy standard when it first passed. Willing to pay up to $10 million to start Efficiency Vermont. I don't know if that was the exact number, but there was a round. And so there's nothing like that in S5. That's concerning. So I think that we would urge you to consider whether there's a maximum acceptable cost for the clean heat standard, that the legislature is willing to say that this is okay to meet our goals. And the last point on this slide really is that the GWSA, in our opinion, is not a mandate to take action at any and all costs. We need to understand what the impacts are to Vermonters. And it calls for the most cost-effective pathways to be prioritized. We can't do that without understanding the analysis.
And just building on that, TJ alluded to the thermal policy analysis that's being carried out right now. So coming out of the last legislative session and all of the concerns around costs of a potential clean heat standard, the Agency of Natural Resources contracted with some expert consultants to have a comprehensive look at both the cost and benefits of a clean heat standard as envisioned in S5, as well as alternative policy alternatives that the state could be considering. The Public Service Department, TJ and I are sitting jointly with the Climate Action Office staff in helping shape that consultant work. And as TJ said, we have some information that'll be forthcoming, but the timing of that is that we'll have a final report probably in June. And again, that's looking at policy options. It's looking at costs and benefits. And I think a really key piece is that it's looking at the distribution of costs and benefits, which demographic segments will be affected and how under this policy or other potential policies. And another key distinction is participants and non-participants, right? So people who take advantage of the programs early on versus those who, for whatever reason, don't participate early. How will their finances be impacted? And as TJ mentioned, the baseline update will be part of that. So again, our lens is we're looking at what needs to happen to meet our GWA requirements and what's going to happen anyway. And again, what is that gap and how do we help fill that gap strategically? And just moving on quickly to some structural considerations. I'm not going to go through all of this given time, but this is a complex proposal, right? I think you've heard from many witnesses. There's a lot of complexity inherent here. Complexity often leads to increased cost. We can do complicated things. And really the question that we're asking is all of this cost and complexity warranted to meet the GWSA requirements? Is this the most cost-effective path to satisfying what the state has committed to doing under GWSA? And I think just to Representative Stebbins' question earlier about the timing, I think another concern is the bill has a foregone conclusion. It really is implementing a clean heat standard. And a lot of work happens before 2025. And at that point, I think I have the concern that the legislature may say, whoa, the cost's too high. And we've already invested a lot of work. There's been a lot of money spent on this concept. And so I think we'd support a more nimble process that was able to account for information that's coming, one, out of the thermal analysis that's happening now, and two, from the public engagement process. So I think as written, S5 is overly prescriptive and doesn't allow for adjustments to be made based on the information that's going to emerge over the next 2-year process. So getting quickly, and again, just on cost, we are focused on trade-offs and administrative costs. Those haven't gotten a lot of discussion. They're not really a fun topic to discuss. But again, we look at, every $1 million spent to administer a policy is roughly 100 homes that can't get weatherized, for example. So just really keeping those trade-offs in mind. And so getting to our recommendation, I think we have maybe 2 minutes. The department's proposal would be to let the thermal sector analysis play out so that this policy discussion can be fully informed with actual cost data and allow those cost estimates to actually inform our policy design and inform the policy direction the state wants to move in. Some transparency to the process, right? This is a proposal that's been developed by a working group and it's gotten a lot of momentum, but there has not been a public process to inform this. And TJ spoke about that. We haven't heard directly from Vermonters. They haven't had a venue or a forum to express their preferences and their concerns. And we'd like the potential study for the thermal sector. I know that was in addition to S5. I think that's a good step. It's a positive improvement. We'd like to see the results of the thermal sector potential study. That would highlight things like market barriers. Are these requirements achievable? And if not, what are the necessary steps we need to take? And then after we have that information from the thermal sector analysis, public engagement, and a potential study, then provide recommendations to the governor and legislature based on findings. Those could come from the PUC or someone else. And again, in the interim, we can take some other steps like requiring the fuel dealers to register with the PUC and report their fuel data. Again, this is just in the interest of information gathering so that we can have an informed policy discussion. There are significant gaps in the information that's available right now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I know we are short on time. I'm glad that we were able to get through this and we know we'll have you back this afternoon. I have a couple of questions. One is around the processes that are going on right now around thermal analysis and reducing thermal emissions with the administration. So ANR is doing thermal analysis, which we're told the results would be available March, April. Check in on March, April.
So yeah, early results. I think the business as usual update should be ready in a couple of weeks. We're seeing the initial, feedback from the contractor today or this weekend. And so there should be some results coming as we go through the next month.
Okay.
The final is not till June.
So I see those processes as being complementary to the process of the clean heat standard. Can you explain kind of
Do you want
Sure, I can,
Yeah, okay.
we can even supplement. I think, so that analysis is looking at a set of policy options. There are 5 options being examined and explored for cost effectiveness. So you will literally get a grid metric that shows the ranking of those different alternatives. And so this bill already presumes the outcome. It presumes we're going to implement a clean heat standard. And what do we do if in July we get analysis that shows there's a different pathway that is more beneficial to Vermonters or enhances equity or is lower cost overall? That's the concern.
We talked about reference the potential study, and I think we'll have you maybe talk about that either this afternoon or sometime next week. The other potential studies that exist. Can you talk about the ability of that to, we know the potential, different potential for cost drivers here are the 2030 goals, and whether or not, and the Secretary Moore's analysis is on meeting the 2030 goals. Can you talk about the potential studies interaction with those types of aggressive goals?
Sure. I'll take this one. So the potential study will really show, it won't start with the target. It will start with, here's what the technical potential is out there. If, technically it is possible to do this much, and then it'll take a step down and say, how much of that is cost effective, right? So we'll have a forecast of the energy savings and the costs, and how much of that technical potential actually is worth doing economically. And then, and we'll look at that both societally and for Vermont. And then it takes another step down and says, this is what's actually achievable. And I think that those kind of 3 layers are all informative in different ways. And so it's a little bit different look in that it doesn't start with the target and a path to get to the target. It really focuses more on, that third level is what can we actually do? And I think the thermal analysis that ANR is doing with our support will shed some light on that, but the potential study will take it to another level.
Okay.
I have a 30-second question. That requires a 10-second answer.
Sure.
Thank you. Quick question and a quick answer, I hope. In its current state of S5, should the workforce be developed before the bill is considered?
I mean, I would say those can happen in parallel, and it is happening, right? We're making significant investments in workforce development, and that can only happen so quickly. So I'd like to see them happening in parallel.
So, and I'm going to follow up on that, and this will be the last question. So when we know that we have challenges around workforce, and we've seen supply chain issues with other items, we know there's market volatility. The Secretary's projections that have been widely reported about the cost to meet the 2030 objectives, when we factor in what's possible, potential of what's possible, limitations on workforce, possible supply chain issues, possible market volatility, a potential study is likely going to show us that we're not able to meet exactly what the Secretary has laid out would result in that cost by 2030, would be my guess, based on what you know about the workforce and supply chain issues. Do you think that is the case? Do you think we have the workforce now to meet the 2030 goals?
We do not have the workforce now to meet the 2030 goals.
So if that's a limiting factor and we have to do less, what will the effect be on the cost, overall cost?
I think that's a great question that the entities that are, the thermal analysis will speak to, and and then ultimately the potential study, if that were to get passed and funded. I don't know, it would be speculation to specifically answer.
If you're doing more in less time, and then you're doing less in that time, what do we expect?
If you're doing,
Cost.
doing less work, then you're gonna have less upfront costs.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that we had some difficulties getting live. We look forward to seeing you here this afternoon.